Hello everyone, and wishing you all a peaceful and wonderful day. Today we're going to spend a quiet summer afternoon together in the mountains, where Trieu Duong notices little Truc Lam struggling with the early summer heat and decides to handcraft a beautiful cocoon-shaped swing beneath the ancient tree so she can rest in the cool breeze while watching the sunlight dance through the leaves. Stay with us to see how one small handmade gift slowly turns into the most peaceful corner of their home this summer. And if you enjoy gentle family moments like these, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. The first days of summer arrived quietly in the mountains, but the air around the old wooden house had already started to feel heavier by noon. The sunlight stretched across the courtyard, warming the stone steps and the bamboo fence until even the wind carried traces of heat. Trieu Duong sat near the doorway repairing a small basket when he noticed Truc Lam lying on the woven mat by the porch. Only a short while had passed, yet her cheeks had already turned pink from the warmth. She kept blinking slowly, one tiny hand resting on her chest while her eyes wandered again and again toward the large ancient tree standing at the edge of the yard. Under the wide canopy, shadows swayed gently with the breeze. The leaves rustled softly above patches of cool earth, and every now and then, a few streaks of sunlight slipped through the branches like thin ribbons of gold. Truc Lam stared at that shaded corner for a long time, her small feet moving slightly whenever the wind drifted across the yard. Trieu Duong paused what he was doing and looked at her quietly. He did not say anything, only watched the way her gaze kept returning to the tree, as if she already knew it was the coolest place around the house. The afternoon became hotter as the cicadas began humming from somewhere deep in the hills. Trieu Duong carried Truc Lam into the shade for a while, letting her rest against his shoulder beneath the old tree. Almost immediately, her body relaxed. Her fingers loosened from the fabric of his shirt, and a faint smile appeared on her face when the breeze touched her hair. Above them, the branches moved slowly, filtering the sunlight into dancing patterns that shifted across her blanket. Trieu Duong looked up at the tree for a moment before turning his eyes toward the house. Not far from the porch, several bundles of bamboo and rattan were leaning against the wall, leftover materials from older projects around the farm. He stood there quietly, gently rocking Truc Lam in his arms, while an idea slowly formed in his mind. The weather would only grow hotter in the coming weeks. The shaded ground beneath the tree was peaceful, but he wanted something softer, safer, and more comfortable, where she could rest during long summer afternoons while still feeling the wind around her. Later that day, after laying Truc Lam down for her nap inside the house, Trieu Duong carried the bamboo strips and coils of rattan beneath the tree. The sunlight had begun to soften slightly, though the air still held the warmth of early summer. He sat on a low wooden stool with his tools beside him and began splitting the bamboo into thinner pieces with careful, practiced movements. Each strip bent slowly under his hands, forming smooth curves as he shaped the frame, piece by piece. The work moved quietly with the rhythm of the countryside. Chickens wandered across the yard, searching through dry leaves, while distant goat bells echoed faintly from the hill behind the house. From inside, Truc Lam occasionally made soft sounds in her sleep, and each time Trieu Duong instinctively glanced toward the doorway before continuing his work. As the structure slowly took shape, the swing began to resemble a cocoon hanging gently from the tree branch above him. The rounded frame curved inward, like a woven nest, large enough for Truc Lam to lie inside comfortably, while still allowing the breeze to pass through the gaps in the rattan. Trieu Duong tested each knot carefully with both hands, tightening the woven sections again whenever they felt even slightly loose. A few times he stopped simply to look up through the leaves overhead. Sunlight flickered through the branches onto the unfinished swing, scattering warm patterns across the bamboo surface. The entire yard smelled faintly of dried grass and fresh-cut rattan. Somewhere nearby, a bird called once before disappearing deeper into the trees. When Truc Lam woke later in the afternoon, she crawled slowly across the mat near the doorway and spotted her father working beneath the tree. She watched him silently for a moment, her wide eyes following the movement of his hands weaving strand after strand together. Then she let out a tiny laugh when the unfinished swing swayed lightly in the breeze. Trieu Duong looked over at her and smiled before continuing his work, his hands never fully stopping. The shadows beneath the ancient tree had already begun stretching longer across the yard, and the cocoon-shaped swing slowly became the center of that quiet summer afternoon. By the time the sun began lowering behind the mountains, the heat around the house finally softened into a gentler warmth. Long shadows stretched across the courtyard, while the old tree swayed quietly in the evening breeze. Beneath its branches, the cocoon-shaped swing now hung securely from a thick limb, moving lightly whenever the wind passed through the leaves. The woven rattan still carried the fresh scent of bamboo, and faint golden light slipped through the small openings in the frame, scattering tiny patterns across the ground below. Trieu Duong stood back for a moment to look at what he had finished. The swing was simple, made entirely by hand, but wide and steady enough for Truc Lam to rest inside comfortably during the hottest afternoons of summer. He reached up once more to test the ropes, pulling gently to make sure the weight settled evenly beneath the branch. The swing rocked softly in response, creaking just enough to blend naturally with the sounds of the countryside. Nearby, Truc Lam sat on a blanket near the porch, watching him with quiet curiosity. Her cheeks were no longer red like earlier in the day, and the cooler evening breeze had already brought some color back to her face. Every few seconds, her eyes returned to the hanging swing, moving slowly beneath the tree. She seemed fascinated by the way it floated back and forth in the fading light. Trieu Duong walked over and crouched beside her, brushing a few loose strands of hair from her forehead. Truc Lam immediately grabbed onto the sleeve of his shirt with one tiny hand, while looking toward the swing again. He smiled faintly at the small gesture before lifting her carefully into his arms. The air beneath the ancient tree felt completely different from the warmth trapped near the house earlier that afternoon. Leaves rustled overhead in slow waves, carrying the cool scent of soil and grass across the yard. Somewhere farther down the hill, water from the small stream could be heard flowing steadily between rocks. The sounds of insects had also softened now, blending gently into the calm rhythm of evening in the mountains. Trieu Duong stepped into the shade and carefully lowered himself into the woven swing, with Truc Lam resting against his chest. The cocoon-shaped frame shifted slightly before settling into a slow, steady sway beneath the branch above them. For a brief moment, Truc Lam stayed perfectly still, her wide eyes moving carefully around the curved bamboo walls surrounding her. Then the breeze drifted through the woven gaps. Her small fingers loosened against her father's shirt almost immediately. She tilted her head back slightly and stared upward through the opening above them, where patches of sunlight still filtered through the leaves overhead. Thin streaks of gold moved softly across her face each time the branches shifted in the wind. Truc Lam blinked slowly, completely focused on the moving light above her. The swing continued rocking back and forth at an easy rhythm, while Trieu Duong rested one arm protectively around her small body. Occasionally, he used his foot against the ground to keep the motion going. Never too strong, only enough for the swing to drift gently beneath the tree. Truc Lam suddenly let out a quiet laugh, when a cluster of leaves overhead fluttered loudly in the wind. The sound was small and breathy, but it made Trieu Duong glance down at her immediately. She looked up toward him for only a second before turning back toward the dancing sunlight above. Her eyes reflected the shifting patterns between the branches, as if she were trying to follow every moving shadow. For a long while, neither of them moved very much. The evening light slowly dimmed around the yard, while the mountains beyond the house turned darker shades of blue. Smoke from a nearby cooking fire drifted lightly through the trees, carrying the familiar smell of burning wood into the cool air. Chickens had already settled near the fence, and even the goats resting along the hillside had grown quiet as dusk approached. Inside the cocoon swing, Truc Lam eventually grew sleepy from the steady motion and the cool evening breeze. Her tiny body relaxed further against her father's chest, and one small hand rested loosely against the woven bamboo beside her. Trieu Duong lowered his head slightly, watching her eyes grow heavier, little by little. Above them, the leaves continued whispering softly in the wind. The swing moved gently beneath the ancient tree while the final rays of sunlight slipped through the branches one last time. Truc Lam looked upward at the glowing patches above her, then turned slightly toward her father with a faint smile still resting on her face, before slowly closing her eyes in the cool shade of the summer evening. As the first days of summer bring heavy heat to the quiet mountain home, Trieu Duong notices little Truc Lam growing uncomfortable while resting on the porch. Her cheeks turn red from the warmth, and her eyes keep drifting toward the cool shade beneath the ancient tree in the yard. Wanting to create a more peaceful place for her to rest, he quietly gathers bamboo and rattan and begins weaving a cocoon-shaped swing by hand beneath the tree. Through the slow rhythm of the afternoon, the handmade swing slowly takes shape while Truc Lam watches her father from nearby. By evening, the finished swing hangs gently under the branches, swaying softly in the cool breeze. Resting safely in her father's arms, Truc Lam gazes up at the dancing sunlight through the leaves, smiling quietly as summer settles around them.